Maria Santos wiped the grease from her hands with an old rag that had seen better days. The smell of motor oil and metal shavings filled the air of Santos Auto Repair, a small garage that had been her second home for as long as she could remember. At 24, she knew every tool in that shop better than most people knew their own kitchen utensils. Her father, Roberto, had built this business from nothing 30 years ago. Back then, he was just a young man with calloused hands and a dream of fixing cars for honest people in their neighborhood. Maria had grown up watching him work magic under the hoods of beat-up sedans and rusty pickup trucks. While other kids played with dolls, she was learning the difference between a wrench and a socket set. By age 10, she could identify engine problems just by listening. By 15, she was rebuilding transmissions after school. Her father never pushed her into the business, but she was drawn to it like metal to a magnet. There was something beautiful about taking something broken and making it whole again. The garage wasn't much to look at from the outside. Paint peeling off the walls, a faded sign that Roberto kept promising to replace, and a parking lot that needed fresh asphalt about 5 years ago. But inside it was a different story. Every tool had its place, every part was organized, and somehow Roberto could find exactly what he needed even in the controlled chaos of his workspace. Maria had just finished changing the oil on Mrs. Patterson's Honda when her father walked over, with a worried expression. He'd been on the phone for the past 20 minutes, and she could tell from his body language that something big was happening. "Mija, we just got a call from Blackstone Automotive," he said, using the Spanish nickname he'd called her since childhood. "They want us to handle some of their overflow work." Maria raised an eyebrow. Blackstone Automotive was the kind of place where people bought cars that cost more than most houses. It was located in the fancy part of town, where everything was polished and perfect. The complete opposite of their neighborhood garage. "Since when do they send work to us?" she asked, genuinely curious. Roberto shrugged. "They're backed up and apparently heard we do good work. Could be good for business, but..." He paused, looking uncertain. "These aren't regular cars, Maria. These are expensive machines. One mistake and we could lose everything." Within a week, their small garage started receiving cars they'd only seen in magazines. A Porsche with engine troubles, a BMW with transmission issues, a Mercedes that needed electrical work. Maria found herself doing mostly basic maintenance while the more complex jobs went to Tony and Kevin, the two other mechanics her father employed. It frustrated her more than she wanted to admit. She had a mechanical engineering degree from the state university, something neither Tony nor Kevin could claim. She understood engines at a level that went beyond just knowing which parts went where. She could see how systems worked together, how changing one thing affected everything else. But in the automotive world, respect came slowly, especially for women. The customers expected to see men working on their cars. Tony and Kevin had been doing this for 15 years each, and while they were good mechanics, they worked from experience rather than understanding the deeper science behind what they were doing. Maria tried not to let it bother her. She focused on doing excellent work, even if it was just oil changes and tire rotations. Every car that left their garage ran better than when it arrived, regardless of who worked on it. The other mechanics weren't mean to her exactly, but they treated her like Roberto's daughter playing around in the garage rather than a qualified professional. When she suggested solutions to problems they were struggling with, they'd listen politely and then continue doing things their own way. "Give it time," her father would tell her. "Respect is earned, not given." But Maria was getting tired of waiting. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in October. Maria was organizing parts in the supply room when she heard the rumble of a large truck outside. Through the window, she watched a fancy car hauler back up to their garage bay. The driver jumped out and started preparing to unload something that was covered by a protective tarp. Roberto came running from his office, followed by Tony and Kevin. Even from inside the building, Maria could sense the excitement and nervousness in the air. This wasn't just another expensive car. This was something special. When they pulled back the tarp, Maria's breath caught in her throat. Sitting on the hauler was a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, painted in the classic Rosso Corsa red that made Ferrari famous. The car was absolutely beautiful, with curves that seemed to flow like water and chrome that gleamed even in the fluorescent lights of their garage. But beautiful wasn't the only word that came to mind. Maria knew enough about classic cars to understand that they were looking at something worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. This wasn't just a car, This was a piece of automotive history. The delivery driver handed Roberto a thick folder of paperwork and shook his head. "Good luck with this one," he said. "It stumped every expert from here to California." As they carefully rolled the Ferrari into the garage, Maria could see why it was there. Despite its stunning appearance, something was clearly wrong. The engine wasn't running smoothly. Even at idle, there was a subtle irregularity that shouldn't exist in a machine that had been engineered to perfection. Roberto opened the folder and started reading. His expression grew more serious with each page. "6 different shops have looked at this car," he told Tony and Kevin. "Ferrari specialists, guys who work on nothing but classic Italian cars. They can't figure out what's wrong with it." Tony whistled low. "And they're bringing it to us?" "The owner is desperate," Roberto explained. "Richard Blackstone bought this at auction 6 months ago. It's been nothing but problems since then. The engine has a misfire that comes and goes. Sometimes it runs perfectly. Sometimes it runs like garbage. No one can predict when it's going to happen or figure out what's causing it." Maria found herself drawn to the car like a moth to flame. While the men discussed the paperwork and the previous unsuccessful repair attempts, she walked slowly around the Ferrari, taking in every detail. She noticed things that might not be obvious to someone just looking at the surface. The car had been modified over the years, small changes that preserved its value but updated some of its systems for reliability. New spark plug wires, upgraded electrical components, a few modern touches hidden beneath the classic exterior. As she studied the maintenance records in the folder, a pattern started to emerge. The problem seemed to occur under very specific conditions. Not just any time, but when certain factors came together in a particular way. While Tony and Kevin debated which approach to take, Maria found herself thinking about electrical systems and how they interact with mechanical components. She thought about temperature changes and resistance values, about how modern components might behave differently than the original parts when subjected to the unique stresses of a 60-year-old car, but she kept her thoughts to herself. After all, she was just Roberto's daughter who changed oil and rotated tires. What could she possibly know about fixing a car that had stumped the experts? For 3 days, the Ferrari sat in their garage like a sleeping giant. Tony and Kevin had tried everything they could think of, but the mysterious misfire remained as elusive as ever. Sometimes the car ran perfectly for hours, purring like a satisfied cat. Other times it would stumble and hesitate, ruining the smooth symphony that a Ferrari engine was supposed to create. Maria spent her lunch break studying the thick folder of documentation that came with the car. While she ate her sandwich, she read through repair records dating back decades. Every service, every modification, every attempt to solve problems was documented in detail. Most mechanics would have glanced through it quickly, but Maria read it like a detective studying clues. She noticed something interesting. The previous repairs showed a pattern that nobody else seemed to have picked up on. In 1987, the car's electrical system had been partially updated. Nothing major, just some components replaced with more modern equivalents to improve reliability. It was the kind of upgrade that classic car owners did all the time to make their vintage machines more dependable. But Maria's engineering background made her think differently about these changes. When you mix old technology with new technology, sometimes unexpected things happen. Different materials expand and contract at different rates. Modern components might have different electrical characteristics than the original parts they replaced. On Thursday afternoon, she was under the hood of Mrs. Chen's Toyota when she heard commotion outside. Through the open bay door, she saw a black Mercedes sedan pull into their parking lot. The car was so clean it looked like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. The man who stepped out was clearly not their usual customer. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Maria's monthly salary, and his shoes were so shiny they reflected the afternoon sunlight. Everything about him screamed money and power. "That's got to be the owner," Tony whispered to Kevin, who immediately started wiping his hands clean on his coveralls. Roberto emerged from his office, straightening his shirt and trying to look professional. The man walked directly toward him with the confident stride of someone used to getting his way. "Mr. Blackstone," Roberto said, extending his hand. "We weren't expecting you today." Richard Blackstone looked around the garage with barely concealed disappointment. His eyes took in the cracked concrete floor, the mismatched toolboxes, and the general organized chaos that characterized Santos Auto Repair. This clearly wasn't what he was used to. "I wanted to see my car," Blackstone said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who owned buildings and companies. And frankly, I'm getting impatient. It's been 6 months since I bought that Ferrari, and $500,000 in diagnostic fees later, everyone tells me the same thing. It can't be fixed. Maria could hear the conversation from where she was working, and she found herself moving closer to listen. There was something in Blackstone's voice that went beyond frustration. This car meant something to him beyond just its monetary value. Your mechanics have had it for 3 days, Blackstone continued. What have they found? Roberto looked uncomfortable. Well, sir, it's a complex problem. Tony and Kevin are experienced mechanics, but this Ferrari has some unique challenges. Unique challenges, Blackstone repeated, his tone suggesting he'd heard similar excuses before. Do you know what I paid for that car? $48 million. Do you understand what that means? The garage fell silent. Even the radio that usually played classic rock in the background seemed to stop. Maria had known the car was expensive, but hearing the actual number spoken out loud made her stomach flip. I didn't buy it as an investment, Blackstone said, his voice softening slightly. I bought it because my father used to tell me stories about cars like that. He worked in a factory his whole life and could never afford anything more exciting than a used pickup truck. But he loved cars, especially Ferraris. He had pictures of them on his workshop wall. This revelation changed the atmosphere in the garage. Suddenly, Blackstone wasn't just a rich man complaining about his expensive toy. He was someone trying to connect with a memory of his father. When he passed away, Blackstone continued, I promised myself I'd own a car like the ones in those pictures. This Ferrari represents something important to me. But if it doesn't run properly, it's just an expensive piece of artwork. Maria found herself stepping forward before she could think twice about it. Mr. Blackstone, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I think I might know what's wrong with your car. Everyone turned to look at her. Tony and Kevin seemed surprised that she was speaking up. Roberto looked nervous. Blackstone's expression was unreadable. I've been studying the maintenance records, Maria continued, holding up the folder. The electrical system was partially upgraded in 1987. Modern components were installed to improve reliability, but I think they might be causing an interaction problem. Blackstone's eyebrows rose slightly. You think you understand something that Ferrari specialists missed? The misfire only happens under specific conditions, right? Maria asked, opening the folder to show him a page of notes she'd been making. Not all the time, but when the engine reaches a certain temperature combined with a particular RPM range. Blackstone's attention was fully focused on her now. How did you know that? Because I think the problem isn't mechanical at all, Maria explained. I think it's electrical. When the engine gets hot enough and runs at the right speed, it creates exactly the conditions needed for a tiny short circuit in the upgraded wiring, so small that it doesn't show up on normal diagnostic equipment, but big enough to cause the misfire. The garage was completely quiet now. Even Tony and Kevin were listening intently. Blackstone studied Maria for a long moment. You're Roberto's daughter, aren't you? The one who changes oil and rotates tires? I'm also a mechanical engineer, Maria said quietly, meeting his gaze. And I've been working on cars since I was 10 years old. Something shifted in Blackstone's expression. He looked at Maria, then at the Ferrari, then back at Maria. A slow smile spread across his face, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just thought of an interesting game to play. Tell you what, he said, his voice taking on a challenging tone. I've been disappointed by experts from coast to coast. Men with decades of experience and reputations built on working with cars like this. You think you can succeed where they've failed? I think I can fix your car, Maria said simply. Then let's make this interesting, Blackstone said, pulling out his phone and checking the time. You have exactly 48 hours. If you can fix my Ferrari and make it run the way it's supposed to, I'll pay you $100,000 in cash. And I'll personally fund whatever automotive business you want to start. The offer hung in the air like electricity before a storm. But, Blackstone continued, his smile becoming sharper, if you fail, you quit the automotive industry forever. You find a different career, something more traditional for someone like you. Roberto stepped forward quickly. Mr. Blackstone, that's not necessary. Maria doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. But Maria was already nodding. I accept. The words came out of her mouth before her brain could stop them. She felt Tony and Kevin staring at her in shock. Her father looked like he might faint. But something inside her had snapped into place like a gear finally finding its proper position. 48 hours, Blackstone repeated, checking his expensive watch. Starting now. As he walked back to his Mercedes, Maria realized what she'd just done. She'd bet her entire future on her ability to fix a car that had stumped some of the best mechanics in the world. But as she looked at the Ferrari sitting in their garage, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt ready. The clock on the garage wall showed 6:30 p.m. when Blackstone's Mercedes disappeared around the corner. Maria stood alone with the Ferrari, feeling the weight of what she'd just committed to. 48 hours to solve a mystery that had defeated everyone else who'd tried. Her father approached slowly, his face a mixture of pride and worry. "Mija, are you sure about this? That man is serious about his bet." "I know, Papa," Maria said, running her hand along the Ferrari's smooth fender. "But I really think I can figure this out. I just need to approach it differently than everyone else has." Tony and Kevin gathered around, both looking skeptical but curious. "What's your plan?" Tony asked. Maria opened the folder of maintenance records and spread the papers across a nearby workbench. "Everyone who's worked on this car has focused on the engine, because that's where the symptoms show up. But I think they've been looking in the wrong place." She pointed to a section of the documentation from 1987. "Look at this. The previous owner upgraded several electrical components, new alternator, updated ignition system, modern voltage regulator. All good improvements, but they were installed in a car that was designed 25 years earlier." Kevin scratched his head. "So what's the problem with that? People upgrade old cars all the time." "The problem is that old electrical systems and new electrical systems don't always play nice together," Maria explained. "It's like trying to run a modern computer program on an old operating system. Sometimes it works fine, and sometimes it creates conflicts." She pulled out a notepad and started sketching a rough diagram of the car's electrical system. "The misfire only happens under specific conditions, right? Not randomly, but when certain factors line up. I think those factors create the perfect situation for an electrical problem to show up." Roberto looked at his daughter's confident expression and made a decision. "Okay, Mija, this is your show. Tony, Kevin, let Maria work on the Ferrari. We'll handle the other cars." As the evening wore on, Maria began the most important investigation of her life. She started by connecting a laptop computer to the Ferrari's diagnostic port, something that required a special adapter, since the car predated modern computer systems. The first few hours were frustrating. Every test she ran came back normal. The engine compression was perfect. The fuel system was clean. The ignition timing was exactly where it should be. By every measurement she could take, the Ferrari should have been running flawlessly. But Maria knew there was something there. She could feel it in the way the engine occasionally hesitated, like it was trying to tell her something. At 10 p.m., she decided to try a different approach. Instead of looking for what was wrong, she would recreate the exact conditions when the problem occurred. She fired up the Ferrari and let it warm up to operating temperature, then began systematically testing different RPM ranges. For 30 minutes, the car ran perfectly. The V12 engine sang its beautiful song without missing a beat. Maria was starting to worry that maybe she was wrong. Maybe the problem really was too mysterious to solve. Then, at exactly 4,200 RPM with the engine at full operating temperature, it happened. A tiny stumble so brief that most people would have missed it. But Maria was listening for it and she caught it. "There you are," she whispered to the car. She quickly shut off the engine and checked her notes. The problem occurred at 4,200 RPM, at full operating temperature, after the car had been running for exactly 37 minutes. Very specific conditions that would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. By midnight, the garage was quiet except for the sound of Maria working. Her father had gone home hours ago, but not before, making her promise to call if she needed anything. Tony and Kevin had left too, wishing her luck but clearly doubtful about her chances. Maria sat on a rolling stool next to the Ferrari, surrounded by electrical testing equipment. She had narrowed down the problem to somewhere in the ignition system, but finding the exact location was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The breakthrough came at 2:17 a.m. She was testing the resistance in various electrical circuits when she noticed something odd. One particular wire showed normal resistance when the engine was cold, but the resistance changed slightly when the engine reached operating temperature. It was a tiny change, barely detectable even with sensitive equipment. But in an electrical system, even tiny changes can cause big problems. Maria traced that wire from the ignition module to where it disappeared into the main wiring harness. The harness was a bundle of dozens of wires wrapped in protective covering, snaking through the engine compartment like electrical arteries. As she carefully examined the harness with a flashlight, she found what she was looking for. In one section, the protective covering showed signs of old damage that had been repaired years ago. Someone had spliced in a new section of wire, but they'd used modern wire to replace the original. Modern wire used different insulation materials than wire from 1962. When the engine got hot, the modern insulation expanded differently than the old insulation around it. This created just enough movement to cause a tiny short circuit, but only under very specific temperature and electrical load conditions. "Gotcha," Maria said out loud, even though no one was there to hear her. She spent the next 2 hours carefully documenting exactly what she'd found. She took photos, made measurements, and wrote detailed notes. If she was going to fix this problem, she needed to understand it completely. The repair itself would be delicate work. The problematic wire was buried deep in the wiring harness, surrounded by other critical circuits. One wrong move could damage something else and make the problem worse instead of better. By 4 a.m., Maria had a complete plan. She knew exactly what was wrong, why it was wrong, and how to fix it. But the actual repair would require steady hands and absolute precision. She decided to take a short break before starting the fix. She made a pot of coffee and sat in her father's office chair, looking out at the Ferrari under the fluorescent lights. In the quiet of the early morning, she allowed herself to really think about what she was doing. If she succeeded, her life would change forever. $100,000 was more money than she'd ever imagined having, and the promise of funding for her own shop could turn her dreams into reality. But if she failed, she'd have to give up everything she loved about working on cars. At 5 a.m., Roberto arrived at the garage with a bag of fresh pastries from the bakery down the street. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "How's it going?" "I found it, Papa," Maria said, showing him her notes and photos. "I know exactly what's wrong and how to fix it." Roberto studied his daughter's documentation with growing amazement. Her investigation had been thorough and professional, like something he'd expect from an experienced diagnostic specialist. "This is incredible work, Misha," he said quietly. "But can you actually fix it?" Maria looked at the Ferrari, then at the clock. She had 18 hours left. "There's only one way to find out," she said, picking up her tools. The most critical 18 hours of her life were about to begin. Maria stared at the Ferrari's engine compartment as the morning sun streamed through the garage windows. She had 18 hours left, and the hardest part was just beginning. Finding the problem had been like solving a puzzle, but fixing it would require the steady hands of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. The problematic wire was buried deep inside the main wiring harness, surrounded by dozens of other critical circuits. One small mistake could damage something else and turn a fixable problem into a complete disaster. In a car worth $48 million, there was no room for error. Roberto brought her a fresh cup of coffee and a breakfast sandwich. "Eat something first," he insisted. "You can't work on steady hands if you're running on empty." Maria reluctantly took a break to eat, even though every minute felt precious. As she chewed her sandwich, she went over her plan one more time. She would need to carefully peel back the protective covering on the wiring harness, locate the exact section of problematic wire, cut out the modern replacement section, and splice in a piece of original specification wire that would behave properly under all temperature conditions. It sounded simple when she explained it, but the reality was much more complex. The wire she needed to replace was only about 6 inches long, but it was surrounded by other wires that couldn't be disturbed. Working in the cramped space of the engine compartment, with limited visibility and even more limited room to maneuver, would test every skill she'd learned over the years. At 8 a.m., Tony and Kevin arrived for work and found Maria already deep into the disassembly process. She had removed several engine covers and moved aside other components to get better access to the wiring harness. "Need any help?" Tony offered, but Maria shook her head. "Thanks, but this is so delicate that I think it's better if I do it myself," she said. Too many hands could make things worse. She spent the next 3 hours carefully exposing the section of wiring harness where the problem wire was located. Using a combination of small knives, precision tools, and infinite patience, she peeled back layers of protective tape and covering without damaging any of the wires inside. By 11 a.m., she had the problematic section fully exposed. Under a bright work light, she could clearly see where someone in 1987 had spliced in a section of modern wire to replace a damaged original section. The repair had been done professionally, but the person who did it couldn't have known that the different thermal properties would cause problems decades later. The next step was the most nerve-wracking. Maria needed to cut out the modern wire section without damaging any of the surrounding circuits. Using a pair of precision wire cutters, she made her first cut. The tiny snip sound seemed incredibly loud in the quiet garage. Roberto watched from a respectful distance, occasionally bringing her tools or adjusting the work light. He could see the intense concentration on his daughter's face and knew better than to interrupt. At 1 p.m., Maria had successfully removed the problematic wire section. Now came the really tricky part, installing the replacement. She had managed to locate a piece of original specification wire from a parts supplier who specialized in classic Ferrari components. It had cost $300 for a 6-inch piece, but it was exactly what the car's electrical system expected. The replacement wire needed to be spliced into the existing circuit at both ends. This required stripping away tiny amounts of insulation, twisting the wires together with perfect precision, and covering each connection with heat shrink tubing to protect against moisture and corrosion. Maria's hands were rock steady as she worked. Years of practice with delicate repairs had trained her fingers to work with precision even under pressure. Each connection took nearly 30 minutes to complete properly. At 3 p.m., she was finishing the second splice when disaster almost struck. As she was applying heat to shrink the protective tubing, a drop of sweat fell from her forehead toward the freshly completed connection. Without thinking, she jerked her hand to block it and nearly pulled the wire loose. "Take a break," Roberto said firmly. "You're pushing too hard." Maria wanted to argue, but she knew her father was right. The pressure was getting to her, and tired hands make mistakes. She stepped outside for 10 minutes, breathing fresh air and trying to calm her racing heart. When she returned, she felt more centered. The final connection went smoothly, and by 4 p.m. she was ready to start putting everything back together. Reassembling the engine compartment was almost as delicate as taking it apart. Every component had to go back exactly where it belonged. Every connector had to be properly seated. Every bolt had to be tightened to the correct specification. At 6 p.m., with 12 hours still remaining on her deadline, Maria was ready for the moment of truth. She had triple-checked every connection, verified that all components were properly installed, and said a small prayer to whatever automotive gods might be listening. Roberto, Tony, and Kevin gathered around as Maria slid into the Ferrari's driver's seat. The leather was soft and expensive, worn smooth by decades of careful use. The dashboard was a work of art, with elegant gauges and switches arranged in perfect harmony. She turned the key. The Ferrari's V12 engine came to life with a smooth, powerful rumble. The sound was absolutely beautiful, like music made from controlled explosions and precisely machined metal. But more importantly, it sounded perfect. No hesitation, no irregular beats, just the pure symphony of a perfectly tuned engine. "So far, so good," Tony said, but everyone knew the real test was yet to come. Maria let the engine warm up to operating temperature, watching the gauges carefully. When the coolant temperature reached the normal range, she began gradually increasing the RPMs. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. At 4,200 RPM, exactly where the misfire had occurred before, the engine continued to run flawlessly. Maria held it at that speed for several minutes, waiting for any sign of the old problem. Nothing. The Ferrari sang like a choir of angels. "Incredible," Kevin whispered. But Maria wasn't satisfied with an idle test. She needed to know the car would perform properly under real driving conditions. With Roberto riding shotgun as a witness, she carefully drove the Ferrari out of the garage and onto the street. For the next hour, they drove through the city, testing every condition they could think of. Stop-and-go traffic, highway speeds, parking lot maneuvering. The Ferrari performed flawlessly in every situation. As they pulled back into the garage, Maria felt a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. She had done it. She had solved a problem that had stumped the best Ferrari mechanics in the world. At exactly 6:30 p.m., 24 hours after accepting Blackstone's challenge, She saw his black Mercedes pull into the parking lot. He was arriving for the final reveal, expecting to collect on his bet. But as he walked into the garage and heard the Ferrari's engine running with perfect smoothness, his confident expression began to change. The sound was unmistakably correct, the sound of a properly functioning machine. Maria shut off the engine and stepped out of the car, wiping her hands on a clean rag. She looked tired but confident, like someone who had just completed the most important work of her life. "Well?" Blackstone asked, though the answer was already written on his face. "Your Ferrari is fixed," Maria said simply. "The misfire is gone. It'll run perfectly from now on." For the first time since she'd met him, Richard Blackstone was completely speechless. Richard Blackstone stood frozen in the doorway of Santos Auto Repair, listening to something he hadn't heard in 6 months. His Ferrari was running, not just running but purring with the perfect rhythm that only a properly tuned V12 engine could produce. The silence in the garage was deafening, as everyone waited for his reaction. Maria stood next to the Ferrari, her coverall stained with grease but her posture confident. She had done exactly what she promised to do, and she knew it. "Turn it off," Blackstone said quietly. Maria reached through the window and switched off the ignition. The garage fell silent except for the gentle ticking sounds of cooling metal. "Start it again," Blackstone commanded. Without hesitation, Maria turned the key. The Ferrari roared back to life instantly, settling into that same perfect idle. No hesitation, no irregular beats, just mechanical perfection. Blackstone walked slowly around the car, his trained ear picking up every nuance of the engine's sound. He had owned dozens of high-performance cars over the years, and he could tell the difference between an engine that was running well and one that was running perfectly. "Take it to 4,000 RPM, he said. Maria slid into the driver's seat and gradually increased the engine speed. The Ferrari responded smoothly, climbing through the RPM range without a single stumble. When she reached 4,000 RPM, she held it there, letting Blackstone listen to the steady, powerful note that filled the garage. This was exactly where the misfire had always occurred before, the spot where every other mechanic had failed to make the engine run properly. But now there was nothing but smooth, uninterrupted power. "Higher," Blackstone said, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. Maria pushed it to 5,000 RPM, then 6,000. The Ferrari sang like a race car, its voice rising in perfect harmony. No matter what she asked of it, the engine responded flawlessly. "Enough," Blackstone said, and Maria brought the engine back to idle. He stood there for a long moment, just listening. Tony and Kevin exchanged glances, unsure of what to expect. Roberto watched his daughter with obvious pride, but also with concern about how Blackstone would react to being proven wrong. Finally, Blackstone spoke. "I want to drive it." "Of course," Maria said, stepping out of the car. Blackstone slid behind the wheel of his Ferrari for the first time in months. The last time he'd driven it, the car had embarrassed him in front of other collectors at a charity event. The misfire had made it sound like a broken lawnmower instead of a precision Italian machine. He put the car in gear and slowly drove out of the garage. For the next 20 minutes, he put the Ferrari through every test he could think of. City driving, highway acceleration, parking lot maneuvers, emergency stops. Every time he expected the old problem to reappear, but it never did. When he returned to the garage, his expression had completely changed. The arrogant businessman who had walked in expecting to collect on an easy bet was gone. In his place was someone who had just witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew. He shut off the engine and sat in the car for a moment, running his hands over the steering wheel. When he finally got out, he looked directly at Maria. "How?" he asked simply. Maria walked over to the workbench where she had laid out her documentation. "The problem was electrical, like I thought. In 1987, someone upgraded part of the wiring with modern components. The new wire had different thermal properties than the original, so when the engine got hot and the electrical load reached a certain point, it created a tiny short circuit." She showed him photos of the repair work, pointing out the section she had replaced. It only happened under very specific conditions, which is why it was so hard to diagnose. Most mechanics were looking for a mechanical problem because that's where the symptoms showed up. Blackstone studied the documentation with growing amazement. The investigation was thorough and professional, the kind of work he'd expect from an expensive diagnostic specialist, not from someone he'd dismissed as just the mechanic's daughter. "This is remarkable work," he said finally. How long did it take you to figure this out? About 18 hours to diagnose it, 6 hours to fix it, Maria replied. 18 hours, Blackstone repeated. The Ferrari specialists I hired spent weeks on this car and never came close to identifying the real problem. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Peterson, it's Blackstone. Cancel the appointment with the Ferrari dealer tomorrow. The car is fixed. Yes, you heard me correctly. I'll explain later. Hanging up, he turned back to Maria. I owe you an apology. When I walked in here yesterday, I saw what I expected to see. A small garage, older equipment, and a young woman who I assumed couldn't possibly have the expertise to solve a problem that had stumped the experts. Roberto stepped forward, unable to stay quiet any longer. Mr. Blackstone, my daughter has been working on cars since she was 10 years old. She graduated with highest honors from engineering school. Just because she's young and female doesn't mean she doesn't know what she's doing. You're absolutely right, Blackstone said. And I was completely wrong. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook. Right there in the garage, with everyone watching, he wrote out a check for $100,000 and handed it to Maria. The first part of our bet, he said. You've earned every penny. Maria stared at the check, unable to quite believe it was real. More money than she'd ever imagined having. Payment for one day's work on a car she loved. But Blackstone wasn't finished. I also promise to fund whatever automotive business you want to start. I meant that. I've built my fortune by recognizing talent and investing in people who can execute at the highest level. You've just demonstrated both. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. Call my office next week. We'll discuss setting up your own restoration shop, full funding whatever equipment you need, and my personal endorsement in the collector car community. The garage erupted in excited chatter. Tony and Kevin congratulated Maria, still amazed at what they'd witnessed. Roberto hugged his daughter tightly, tears in his eyes. But Maria was thinking about more than just the money and the opportunity. Mr. Blackstone, she said, I want to ask you for something else. Name it, he replied. I want you to tell people what really happened here. Not just that your car got fixed, but how it got fixed. There are other women in this industry who have the skills but don't get the opportunities. They need to see that it's possible. Blackstone nodded slowly. I'll do better than that. I'll make sure this story gets told to everyone in the collector car world, and I'll make sure they understand that the best diagnostic work I've ever seen came from someone they would have overlooked completely. 3 months later, Santos Restoration opened its doors in a state-of-the-art facility across town. The shop specialized in high-end classic car restoration, with Maria as the lead technician and Roberto as the business manager. Their first customer was Richard Blackstone, who brought them a 1954 Mercedes Gullwing that needed a complete restoration. The story of how Maria fixed the Unfixable Ferrari spread through the collector car community like wildfire. Soon they had a waiting list of customers who wanted the mechanic who could solve problems that stumped everyone else. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months later, when a young woman knocked on the shop door. She was fresh out of mechanical engineering school, looking for a chance to prove herself in the automotive world. I heard about what you did with that Ferrari, she said to Maria. I was wondering if you might have room for an apprentice. Maria smiled, remembering what it felt like to be young and talented but overlooked. Let's see what you can do, she said, leading the young woman into the shop. The cycle was beginning again, but this time talent would be recognized regardless of who possessed it.